Good morning, everybody. Welcome to today's Meeting of the Minds webinar, New Findings on the Impact of AVs on Urban Space Inequality and Outward Migration. My name is Jessie Feller-Hahn. Many of you know me. I'm the Executive Director of Meeting of the Minds. Meeting of the Minds is a nonprofit global thought leadership network and platform for knowledge sharing with year-round programming. We connect global urban sustainability, innovation, and technology leaders across sectors to share best practices, tools, and solutions through our digital platform, including our webinar series, thought leadership videos, publishing platform, executive cohort program, and other virtual convenings. A few housekeeping notes to begin. Because of our very large audience in attendance today, you will remain muted throughout the event. A recording of today's webinar will be emailed to you after the event for you to share with colleagues that couldn't make it today. You can also find a PDF of today's slides, of Chris's slides, on the website tomorrow. We will have a Q&A during the second half of the hour. When you do have a question, please type them into the questions panel in your attendee control panel on the right of your screen as you think of them. We would also really appreciate your input regarding today's webinar, so a short survey will pop up when you close your browser at the end of the event. I'm very pleased to introduce our presenter today. Chris Zegras is Professor of Mobility and Urban Planning and the head of MIT's Department of Urban Studies and Planning. He serves on the executive board of the BRT Center of Excellence and the International Scientific Committee for the Centro de Desarrollo Urbano Sustentable, which is in Chile, I think, Chris. Will you have to correct me if I'm wrong? At MIT, he serves on the Climate Nucleus. From 2015 to 2020, he was the lead principal investigator for the Future Urban Mobility Research Group, sponsored by the Singapore MIT Alliance for Research and Technology. From 2007 to 2016, he was Transportation Systems Focus Area Lead for the MIT Portugal program. His research focuses on human behavior, digital transformation, and strategic planning techniques and technologies. So with that, I'm going to let Chris take it away. Chris, take it away.
Thank you so much, Jessie. Thanks everyone for the invitation. Thanks for organizing this, my second participation as a presenter at Meeting of the Minds. Looking forward to this, and I'll just dive in without further ado. I'm presenting some work today that was based out of some research we did in Singapore, as Jessie referred to, and needless to say, I'm one member of a very large research team. This particular work is, you can see the co-authors here. And just a note, the affiliation is indication of affiliation at the time the research was conducted. Not everyone is currently, well, nobody is currently with the group Future Mobility as we reached our sunset. The research group closed a year ago. Anyway, today I will talk some background to the motivation for this presentation, although probably you're all familiar with what I'll talk about, then some of the objectives, the methods, what we do in the specific application, what we find, and then some limitations, implications, conclusions, and areas for future research. So as I said, the motivations for this, well, we're all familiar with it. Presumably that's why many of you might be here today. Everyone across the board is infatuated with automated vehicles. I do use automated specifically because I believe the vehicles we want should be automated. If they're autonomous, that means they're doing whatever they want, as opposed to what we would like. But maybe that's my own opinion. We hear this as autonomous vehicles, self-driving cars, driverless cars, and this technology, as we all know, has been evolving extremely rapidly. In fact, the research group that in Singapore debuted, and I will first say I was not on the technology side, the vehicle or sensor technology side of this research group, but I was doing some of the systems analysis. Started with a driverless buggy on the campus of National University of Singapore in 2010, and by 2017, the technology had been acquired by Delphi for about $500 million. And this was kind of by some accounts, like 2017, and I'll get to this in a moment, was considered like the year of peak hype for AVs. But I'll talk about that more in a moment, just so we're all on somewhat of the same page. What we are talking about with automation, this comes from the SAE International. They have a more slightly more refined version of the levels now and what they mean and don't mean, but I like this one because it gets the basic point across. Everyone's familiar with stage one, driver assistance. Probably very few of us have ever actually been in a stage 5 vehicle or a level 5 vehicle, and most of us are actually, used to say a level 3 vehicle, or a level, 2 vehicle. But we're in the state of AVs in general is in the world of level 3. Now, when will we actually get to the sought after level 5? Personally, I've stopped predicting. Never really tried to predict, but this is an example of a website. You can see the link below. They've stopped updating it, or the blogger who tried to keep track of where the industry announcements were. When I first started looking into this seriously, I was trying to figure out what's the state of the different enterprises, and I'd go back occasionally to this particular inventory, and they basically stopped taking count. And you can see that none of these predictions circa 2017 are realized today. And some of you might in fact be familiar with the Scientific American article that came out just about 4 months ago. And again, it alludes to the peak of the hype being around 2017, roughly the date of this table when I last was looking, or it was last being updated, when virtually every major motor vehicle manufacturer and high-tech company predicted that we'd be widespread automated driving systems by 2020. And while that year's passed, and we know that that's not really a reality. Some of the challenges that were identified in this article was, still pretty limited range of conditions, rainfall, snowfall, etc. Really not enough, some clear identification that multiple independent data sources were necessary, and probably vehicle-to-vehicle communication necessary, and like very, very, very strong safety assurance is necessary. And this article concludes, and again, it's just one article, that most likely in the near term we might see local package delivery, long-haul trucking on motorways, fixed urban transit services, ride hailing, and this last one I highlight because in fact this is an example of what I'll be talking about today. Now, so automated vehicles, AVs, that's one of the critical motivations, and the second is what we are calling mobility on demand. But you're all familiar with it pretty much wherever in the world you're from. You've used Uber or Lyft, or at least have seen it, or maybe Grab in Asia, Didi, and so forth. So this is the second motivation for our study, mobility on demand, otherwise known as TNCs, transportation network companies. And we know what these are being driven by, the popularity of the shared economy in general, and they've been manifest globally. I picked this up from a website run by Bloomberg, and it's interesting, in fact, that this evidence suggests there's, despite the last few years and the pandemic reality we've been living, they're already emerging from the deep early depths of the pandemic, Uber and Lyft. It'd be interesting to actually look at this relative to the total demand of travel in this particular market, which is in the United States. So to narrow down to the specifics, in our research, we focus on the convergence of automation, or automated vehicles, and mobility on demand, what we call automated mobility on demand. I'll use the abbreviation AMOD. And this is essentially a system of shared AVs. They're not personal private ownership AVs. Key distinction, this is not everyone, this is not a Tesla in your garage, if you're fortunate enough to be able to afford a Tesla. Now, indeed, this, so it's a convergence of automation and sharing, SAV, some knows as, and there's been a lot of talk about the potential benefits in terms of efficiency, reliability, et cetera, et cetera. And in fact, if you live in Phoenix, you can sort of experience this today, as I understand it, using Waymo, which I understand you can actually book through Google Maps, although I've never done it myself, never having had the fortune of visiting the great city of Phoenix. So now let's step back a moment, and there's been a lot of future-looking studies. I'm going to show you one in a moment, but a lot of this is still crystal balling. And I think for a moment, which is important to go back and just look at kind of the theoretical effects. The Rand Corporation, about almost 8 years ago now, no, sorry, 6 years ago now, published a study examining, among other things, the theoretical impacts of AVs on, among other things, congestion and VMT. So this just shows a theoretical identification of what we would expect AVs to have on VMT, vehicle kilometers traveled in those places that use VKT. This is VMT, meaning vehicle miles traveled. But in general, AVs, by reducing the real and generalized perceived, generalized costs of travel, should increase demand for travel, aka increase VMT. Now, this is except to the degree that they might induce vehicle sharing. This could include providing transit-like services, which might be smaller fleets to serve niche demands, and thus also might have longer-term impacts on reduced vehicle ownership, and also, for example, reduced demands for parking. But even this we should keep in mind, however, might cannibalize existing public transit modes. And the mobility on demand, or the TNCs, the evidence suggests this is in fact what's happening. And so all of this suggests that a priori, the jury remains pretty out there, open vis-a-vis the overall benefits. Much of it depends on the policy choices that we would make and how these vehicles actually become incorporated into our mobility systems, and that the impacts could well be multifaceted, not just on mobility, but on urban space and urban growth more generally, which I'll talk about. So just to give one example of the crystal ball method, again, simulation tools. Crystal ball doesn't mean to demean the importance of these tools, as I work with them myself. We actually did a simulation-based approach for a city like Boston. I mean, it was basically using much of the Boston data, but we didn't say it is Boston. And that this analysis suggests that introducing an AMOD type service cannibalizes mass transit, increases VKT and congestion, and that actually what would happen is if you integrate AMOD and transit, that's that last column there, AMOD TI, we would get slightly better outcomes both in terms of VKT and congestion. Happy to talk a little bit about more about that when there are questions. This sort of model actually feeds into the same model, but of course applied to the Singapore case, feeds into the midterm model that we use for the results I'll present in a moment. But it's important to note that the Boston case that I'm showing here did not account for longer term impacts, which would include impacts on urban growth patterns. And that is this analysis focused on what we call midterm impacts, which are basically considered like daily and weekly travel decisions. It doesn't include impacts on vehicle ownership, much less impacts on job relocation, residential relocation, and so forth. But as we all know, our urban areas and our built environments evolve together with mobility technologies. This is an image I pulled from a textbook, The Geographies of Urban Transportation, the chapter by Mueller from 2004, where he nicely outlines kind of the history of the co-development between urban growth and mobility technologies in the United States. I'd say some version of this has been lived out, in different years and different eras, perhaps in other parts of the world. This begs the question, okay, where are we now? If the post-war period of the last century was the freeway period in the United States, where are we today? Are we in the automated vehicle period? Are we in the virtual remote, the remote mobility period? Where are we? Probably the next historian that looks back on this will identify this as something we're not yet have identified. But without getting into any of the details, what traditional economic theory, again, this is like urban econ 101, if that, would tell us that as travel costs go down, and that's what AVs would do, as I said before, reduce the cost, real and perceived generalized costs of travel. Well, we would expect densities to go down and urban expansion to increase. So the question is, should we expect anything different with shared AVs and so on? To summarize some of the longer term impacts, I said, that the value of time, there's impacts we don't yet know on it, although there's some very interesting research being done on this, including at Georgia Tech and elsewhere, on kind of, well, what is the value of time? What does automated travel mean for the value of time for the driver? Congestion might decrease, but our tolerance for congestion may well increase. This would be expansionary no matter what for the urban growth. What happens to parking? This is greatly influenced by whether we move to a shared version versus a personal version. This is policy truly matters. And then we can think about other effects I'm not going to get into in our analysis today, but if these vehicles truly are like really, really safe, we could have smaller roadway footprints, right? You could reduce the right-of-way requirements. We could combine them with electric vehicles, and we can have the vehicles moving into buildings. For those of you who've had the luck of going to Stockholm, for example, you'll see they have an electric bus with some of the bus stops actually in the lobbies of buildings. But there's a big question that's still out there: is well, what do AVs imply for the demand for density and thus the future of cities? Will they be a centripetal force or a centrifugal force? And it's important to note that there's a lot of other things going on in the world that might matter much more, such as the future of work. We're all kind of experiencing this. How demand for space will be post-pandemic, et cetera, et cetera. None of those exogenous forces will I talk about in the analysis that I will present today. So, with all of that as motivational background, let's talk about a little bit of the knowledge gaps we're trying to fill today. There has been not that much work yet on the impact of services like AMOD on accessibility and long-term mobility choices and urban growth patterns, as I suggested. Most studies that do exist don't really have a whole lot of granularity, either spatiotemporal or demographic. And in general, many of the integrated simulation models out there, irrespective of what they're looking at, have a pretty weak depiction of housing market behavior. And so what I'm going to talk about today are some of the models we've been using trying to help move these tools in the right direction, so to speak. Most specifically today, what I'll talk about, and then hopefully we can discuss, is, well, what is the impact of AMOD on individuals' accessibility, and how does this effect vary across socioeconomic groups, and then how might that change our expectations regarding residential location patterns. And in this case, looking at two different types of scenarios with respect to the implementation of AMOD. Okay, so now let's turn to the specific methods that we use in this work. I alluded before to this sort of a joke of a crystal ball, but essentially we have developed an attempt to look into the future. It's an empirically based attempt, and it's got fairly rigorous microeconomic foundations and pretty rigorous data. But again, we're just using all of this to look into a future that we don't know what it will really look like. Our approach is to use agent-based microsimulation, where we're modeling individual behaviors, both short. In this case, we're modeling the long-term mobility decisions, and based on medium-term or mid-term mobility modeling. And we do some scenario analysis where we look at two different AMOD scenarios. And as I suggested, we use a tool that we developed in Singapore, and it's an integrated agent and activity-based simulation platform that we call SimMobility. Very briefly, this is a project that has been developed for the past 12 years, that we really started the version of SimMobility in Singapore around 2010. Huge research team. And I'm only going to talk briefly about it, but it's essentially, I say it's integrated because it's integrated in the temporal developed dimensions of relevance, short-term being fractions of seconds decisions. You can think of this as lane changing behavior, midterm being daily, minutes and hours, like the activities we pursue, the modes where we choose to pursue them, the modes we take to get there, the routes we take to get there. And then the long term is where we decide to live, how many vehicles we own, and so forth. It's integrated in the sense that it's the same agents making decisions across the 3 timeframes. You don't need to run the entire package in an integrated fashion. Today we use in the work I'll show you today, we were using the midterm and the long-term model. And it's also important to note that it is both a freight and a passenger model, although the freight side is somewhat less developed currently because of data and other problems that many of you are probably more familiar with than I am. Okay, so I'll quickly get into just the 2 models that are relevant for today. SimMobility midterm is an activity-based model. This is, some of you are probably familiar with the work of Moshe Ben Akiva. He's on the team. He's been leading for both the midterm and the short-term modeling. So this is essentially implementing his activity-based approach. The critical thing to keep in mind here is that we are using the activity-based accessibility outcome from the midterm model to feed some of the long-term models. So there's two reasons this is important. One, because it's a theoretically consistent link to long-term. Also, activity-based accessibility can, in theory, be used as a very good, an economically rigorous evaluation criteria because it's a measure of welfare or consumer surplus. I won't talk about that today. But slightly more conceptually, it's relatively straightforward. Mathematically and computationally, it's pretty complex. But essentially, here's an example for those that can hopefully see this of the various decision choices that are made in the daily model. So these are you can think of these as basically just a number of nested choices. And the choices made in the lower levels of the nest feed up to the higher level nest, and the highest level of this nest, in this particular case, the day pattern level, that represents what we call activity-based accessibility. Those that are familiar with these types of models, this is also known as the log sum or the expected maximum utility of the entire choice set for an individual when they're thinking about what they're going to do with their day. That's an extremely simplified way of presenting it, but hopefully you sort of get the point. And again, we can talk about this more in the Q&A for those that are interested. Now, the long-term model, this is just an example of, this is just a representation of the residential real estate side, although on the commercial side, somewhat similar, somewhat analogous model holds. But basically, we are modeling individual daily bidding actions. So that's that dark green box in the middle where supply and demand match. So households are bidding on units, and we simulate this model. We simulate this auction. So this is a somewhat realistic market interaction where the bidder has a willingness to pay model on the demand side, and the supplier of units has a hedonic price model, which is kind of the expected price on the supply side. And there's some agreement or not, and a bid is made. If the bid is accepted, then there's the choice to move. After the choice to move, the agents make new decisions regarding job, school location choice, vehicle ownership choice. In the Singapore case, we actually have taxi availability in there. It's not really relevant, at least in the United States, but households own taxis in Singapore, and that actually influences their likelihood of owning other vehicles. Which is, for those familiar with Singapore, recognize it's in part because of the high vehicle ownership costs in the city. Now, I've just shown you that, again, hopefully you'll recall, that's a simplified version of the activity-based midterm model. And so that log sum value, the activity-based accessibility, or ABA, links to several models in the long term. Specifically, it figures into the willingness to pay of the, well, first we have the screening model, which decides is the household even interested in possibly moving. So essentially you can think of it, the household looks around, calculates its accessibility that we simulate for a bunch of other locations, and with other characteristics of the screening process decides whether or not to move. And then when they decide if they're in the market to move, they go around and they start bidding, where again, they're calculating what's the accessibility value of this place relative to all the other characteristics of this place of interest, and thus how much am I willing to pay. It also figures into the supply side because the accessibility figures into the hedonic price function for the supplier. And it also figures into eventually the job and school location choice and the vehicle ownership choice. Now, one very important caveat I'm going to point out, or shortcoming here, for the moment, and again, I would be interested to hear others' experience here, we're only modeling the accessibility of the so-called head of household. So basically, because of a lack of data on the household interactions in a household, we use a somewhat traditional travel survey to estimate our models. And also because, frankly, it's still a very challenging modeling problem of how do you model household interactions to get an overall household level accessibility, which would ultimately be feeding into these models, because in fact some households might much more weigh accessibility to schools versus accessibility to jobs or other potential activities when they're making these longer term choices. So, just note that caveat, please. Okay, now to the application. As I mentioned, it's Singapore. We examined the AMOD prospects via those simulation tools I just presented in Singapore. Once more, as I said, where SimMobility was originally developed through a research center that was supported by the Singaporean government. Briefly, we use a synthetic population of about close to 7 million individuals. The synthesis is mostly done based on the household interview travel survey. In Singapore, it's done every 4 years. It's about 12,000 households, at least in the last one. And then we construct the built environment from a range of sources about parcels and other relevant data attributes or attributes of other relevant elements that manifest themselves in the built environment. The activity-based models in the midterm are estimated on the HITS data, that's the travel survey data, and then we calibrate them with some smart card data. And then we actually did a stated preference survey data for AMOD adoption, which we also use in calibration. I'll talk about that briefly. And then the housing market models are based on transaction data, resale data, and again, the HITS data on the household side. Clearly, getting into the detail of this synthetic construction of the city and the model estimation would be a presentation in itself. The scenarios that I referred to, we have a baseline, which is basically nothing's different. We have what we call partial animation, where the service that we call AMOD is introduced as an additional mode to the current mobility ecosystem. And then we have what we call full automation, which is AMOD becomes the a complete substitute for the private vehicle fleet. This is probably considered by most to be totally unrealistic. In the Singaporean condition, it might be slightly less unrealistic, but there was interest in examining this kind of as an edge case of how far could you push automation in changing the way mobility operates in our cities. So basically, in this case, AMOD is a fleet of fully automated and shared on-demand vehicles. And in each of these scenarios, that activity-based accessibility varies due to the changes in the mode availability, which also then cascades through the system, including how it affects residential choices. Just a couple of other details on the simulation. Because the whole system is, there's stochastic variation in the micro simulation, we do 10 one-year runs. And then we take the average. We do the way we priced AMOD was as 75% of the cost of conventional taxis, with another 30% savings if the rides are shared. We did additional modifications to the utility function based on the stated preference survey that I talked about. I referred to a little bit earlier. For those that are interested, I'm happy to share that that research. Basically, in that case, we just changed the alternative specific constants and the willingness to pay, which we basically use that to match the ratio of shared AMOD modes with transit modes, and then use that to adapt the utility function in AMOD vis-a-vis the choice of AMOD. And then the AMOD level of service and fleet size was updated through running the midterm and long-term modules. So we arrived at like a ideal number of vehicles. And basically that arrived at a fleet of about 29,000 or 34,000 AMOD vehicles in the partial automation or the full automation scenarios, respectively. Okay, so first of all, so I'm going to show a couple of slides with figures now, which look at overall accessibility, or look at accessibility, this one being overall. In all of these figures, we're not showing any outliers. The median is the black, and the mean is the red dotted lines. And in all cases, unless otherwise noted, this is PA, partial automation, FA, full automation, and all of this is relative to baseline, the baseline case. So we can say that you can see here that there's gains in accessibility in net for the partial automation scenario. There's a net loss in accessibility in the full automation scenario. This is probably unsurprising because you're basically decreasing individuals' choice sets. We can look, one of the benefits of this modeling approach is we can look at individual attributes, so you can see how these effects might vary across gender. I don't have time to get into this now. You can see how these effects vary across age. Again, if we have time, we can get back into this later. And you can see how these effects vary across income. I think it's here to note that, the accessibility impacts for low-income folks in general are smaller. This is most likely due to the fact that most of them don't, will probably continue to be, or choose to continue using the traditional public transit system, and they don't have drastic effects when people's cars are taken away, because most of them don't own vehicles. In fact, if you look, you can see here, unsurprisingly, that the non-car owners benefit more, with important losses for car owners in the the full automation scenario. Again, this is not surprising. Okay, so now let's turn to the spatial accessibility impacts. This is showing the zone averaged activity-based accessibility by residents, where green means higher and darker means larger. So red, the darker the red, the larger the negative impact. You can see that, so you see the baseline accessibility, the PA is partial accessibility, and FA is partial automation, and FA is full automation. And we can see, in fact, full automation has pretty important accessibility decreases across the metropolitan area of Singapore, that being, the island. One important note here, I think, is Singapore is across the strait from Malaysia, and in fact, there's Singaporean suburbs essentially exist in Malaysia. I mean, maybe that would be fair to say to the people who live in Malaysia, but from a functional perspective, I'm not talking about a political perspective, there's lots of flow across those bridges every single day with workers coming into Singapore. That is outside of the boundaries of our model, clearly area for future research. Just to look at the housing market summary, again, this is that bidding, and we can see that the accessibility changes lead to a change in the housing market. We have slightly higher number of bids in both the partial automation and in the partial automation scenario. We have lower in the full automation scenario. All of this is due in part to the accessibility increases and decreases. But we have a similar number of successes across successes, meaning like a bid that was accepted. And there's a higher successful rate in the full automation, and this might be reflected in the lower expectation of sellers. Keeping in mind that the sellers base their asking price in part on estimates from the hedonic model, which includes the accessibility measure. Whoops, sorry. To give you now, looking at how this plays out in space, where we would expect residential relocation to happen. In this, again, greener is in this case, greener means a larger net increase and redder means a larger net loss. The regional level statistics show somewhat similar patterns in the baseline and the partial animation. In full automation, we actually see a larger inward relocation. So basically, there's an attraction back to the city center. Essentially, the city center in full automation becomes more attractive. If you look at this with slight more resolution across the household types, basically we see the city center attracts larger, wealthier, multi-earner households that have children. This, if we accept, take this as a plausible possible future, then this means that there's a larger a potential gentrification effect. And this is consistent with some people's thinking and analysis on what services like automated mobility on demand might do. Of course, once more, keep in mind this is all based on models that were estimated well before the pandemic, and that might have had changes on residential choice and commercial choice, location choice decisions for which we don't have any data, much less any models that are currently relevant. Okay, so I'll take, recognizing I probably raced through that extremely quickly, but being conscious of the 3 minutes remaining, I'll quickly go through a couple of the conclusions. Our findings if you believe that you could possibly substitute all private cars with a service like AMOD, this clearly would have distinct influences on individual accessibility. And, our modeling approach allows us to see this. In the Singaporean case, we looked at gender, income, household size, etc. But you can look at, other attributes that you are able to represent in your model based on the data you have and the societal concerns you might have. Mostly the more privileged groups have larger impacts of accessibility. The complete substitution of private modes by AMOD, actually favors lower income people. And this is not necessarily, this is sort of obvious because most of them don't have cars, and the inverse is the car-owning households would be greatly penalized. And I think, once more in the full automation scenario, we saw that the center city becomes more attractive, especially for larger and richer households with kids. A few points worth discussing. I think, once more, a caveat that the accessibility that we talked about, and as we use it here, does not account for the full picture of mobility, especially because we're not looking at intra-household interactions. But overall, we can believe that AMOD service, in the way we've designed it here, doesn't fill private mobility shoes with respect to accessibility. That shouldn't be surprising, I don't think. Full automation, the FA AMOD does have some apparent reduction in social inequality with respect to accessibility. But that leads itself to the question, well, what if you just did a private ban without any AMOD? Of course, not likely to happen anywhere. We find little evidence for induced sprawl, but once more, this is Singapore, right? It is an island. There's not much space to sprawl. I alluded to Malaysia. Maybe there could be an idea that people would end up fleeing across the strait. And once more, the central areas seemingly become more attractive. This is in the full AMOD implementation. Quickly, a couple areas of future research. One that we are continuing to work on. In fact, we just published a paper on this. It's coming out soon, looking at the AMOD, using a stated preference survey we did to look at AMOD impacts on weekly and longer activity patterns, recognizing that people might, this might make people change how often they go shopping and where. And this gets bundled into, people's weekly decision making. Once more, has impacts on intra-household interaction that we're not able to capture. A few other areas where we could clearly make some additional inroads, I think, would be in looking at how the taste parameters might vary in different scenarios. Again, capturing intra-household dynamics, as I spoke about earlier. Looking at this with some sensitivity analysis regarding the fleet size and the pricing and other related aspects, such as wait times and so forth. We have only looked at the moment on residential market, not the other relevant longer-term decisions, such as job and school location, the supply of new development, and maybe even demographic changes, although that's probably a little bit too much conjecture. And then finally, of course, extensions to broader impacts in other places, including in Boston. We've looked at the wheels to wells life cycle costs, for example, of an electric AMOD service implemented in a city like Boston. So I will end with my obligatory acknowledgements. Huge thanks to the Singaporean government for the support. You can read all of the various natures of that support here. And then finally, there's a number of references that I referred to throughout. Jesse had indicated the slides will be made available, so you can actually have the full relevant set of references that fed into this presentation when you look at the slide deck, and I will stop now. Thank you.
Thank you, Chris. Wow, so much content, incredible research. Wonderful. We're gonna let the audience, we're gonna do our Q&A now. So if folks have questions, you can type them into the questions panel on the right of your screen. If you need to open that questions panel, you need the arrow pointing down. We can also go back to any slides if you want Chris to elaborate on, he went through that age slide pretty quick. Maybe folks have questions about some of that stuff. So please put your questions in there and we'll have a discussion with Chris. There's already a question from Lynn Kaiser, Chris. Lynn says, I used to think that AVs would have a big impact on residential relocation. Now I think that Zoom is the real driver of where people live. This was at the very beginning, which you alluded to a little bit over. Do you want to elaborate on your current thinking on remote future of work impacts or necessary research in that area?
Um, yeah, I mean, I can only, not having done it, I mean, clearly this is on many, many people's mind, whether you're in the urban planning field or the urban mobility field or the interurban mobility field,
Yeah.
or the kind of equity of regions um, interest. So I can't really offer more than some modestly informed conjecture, but I think my own take is history will tell us that history tells us that the telecommunications ultimately is a complement for physical mobility, right? I mean, now this might change because, like, are we now experiencing the, will the metaverse completely substitute all out of office or out of bed activity patterns? I'd like to hope not as a human being, but I can't be sure. But I mean, we've been talking about telecommunications replacing travel since the dawn of telecommunications, and it hasn't. Now, what will this mean for the future of downtown? What will this mean for the future of density? What will this mean for the future of demand for amenities and all of those other things that we, or those that, believe cities are important? I don't really know. I think it's an area rich for research. But I also would say, what's going on in the more general area of the automation of work, for which automated mobility is just one tiny piece,
Mhm.
is going to have massive impacts. So for those futurists out there, it's, I guess, a good time, but I guess it's always a good time to be a futurist. Yeah, so I'm sorry. I would love to have a good answer to your question. In fact, what I would
Hard.
really love to have is some good time to do some research to help answer that question. But
Yes,
I have,
anybody out there on the webinar who wants to fund Chris doing research on this, we're welcome checks if you want to send Chris a check. Nick Price is wondering, Chris, how far away really are we from full automation? You need a crystal ball for today's webinar, clearly.
yeah, I don't know. I mean, I'll permit me to go back. I'll jump through these slides, right? And
Yeah,
I mentioned that I stopped, like, looking at, because I was interested. Okay, when is this going to happen? And this, I'll emphasize, this is only one blog. I don't know how, but the person who generated it seemed to be going through all of the press releases of the firms, and so I went and kind of double checked it, and I was trying to update it myself. And as far as I can tell, none of them have been met, right? I mean, like, I remember that Toyota was planning on having highway capable level 5 by the Olympics. I don't think they hit that. So, again, we already have Waymo operating in Phoenix. So I think we'll see that we see automated services already operating in closed off districts,
and
right?
Cruise in San
Um,
Francisco, right?
right.
Taxi hailing.
And so but I think that I believe we're still pretty far off before we're all going to have the choice of going to the dealer and being like, can I get the automated version? But by when? 2030? But don't bet on that, please.
Nobody could have predicted the pandemic, so we're not in the business of
Yeah.
predictions anymore.
And I
Um,
also just want to emphasize, like, the technology underlying the capabilities here, first of all, I am not trivializing it at all. And much more equally importantly, that is not my area of expertise. Like, I'm just an urban analyst. And I'm like, okay, automated vehicles, sure, let's see.
yeah, let's look at the impacts. Good. Ryan Westrom, hi Ryan, says, fantastic stuff, Chris. Lots of questions, but let's start with this. Did you consider the possibility that value of time in vehicle shifts based on whether a personal driven vehicle versus an AV, e.g., perhaps we're more willing to ride in an AV than drive? Personal value of time considerations, any thoughts?
First of all, so nice to hear from you, Ryan. I wish we could be like, doing this over a cup of coffee or something. So as we struggled with this a lot. So as I mentioned, in we calibrated our utility functions for what we call AMOD based on this stated preference survey that we did in Singapore. The survey approach itself was somewhat sophisticated. We call it a context specific stated preference, where basically we used a smartphone based data collection technology to collect people's travel survey data as in a normal way, but on a smartphone. But then we use that data to go back to people and say, okay, well, this was what you did last week, and we would represent it to them visually. If this was an option, what would you have chosen? But we really couldn't figure out how, in that context, to get to the people's idea of, and you could be sitting in the back reading the newspaper, chatting with your neighbor, or holding hands with your lover, whatever. We had a very difficult time trying to figure out how to represent that. So, I think that could be represented very interestingly, for example, in a virtual reality stated preference survey, which I would love to see if we could, get some support to. And so basically, we don't get to that, and the only way we varied the utility functions, as I said, was based on a price modification, and then some calibration of the utility function based on the mode shares of AMOD versus traditional transit, with the assumption or the underlying implication that that is sort of like the travel time savings of, or the value of time impact of not having to drive, but recognizing, if you're on the train during rush hour in Singapore, you're probably maybe staring at your phone in a jam setting. So the short answer is, Ryan, not really. And it's an extremely interesting question. And I would recommend those interested to look at some of the work done by Pat Mokhtarian at Georgia Tech, who's been looking at these types of questions, amongst many other scholars. But I'm somewhat familiar with Pat's work.
Awesome. Thanks, Chris. And speaking of price sensitivity, there's a question from Rick Stein on that. Rick says, ultimately, isn't sensitivity to price the only way to manage demand? In other words, if you want your groceries delivered between 4 and 5, or you want to travel at a certain time, then you pay more for it. Thoughts on price sensitivity inducing demand and managing demand?
Yes, that's a great question. So,
Another
as
study.
I said, no. So as I said, there was, as I hope you can imagine, like I did a pretty quick run through of a pretty long, somewhat impressive, although you better the judge of that, but like certainly intensive model development and implementation project, of which we had a large team. And so I wish some of the other team members, especially from midterm, were here to better answer that question, because like my familiarity of how they calibrate supply and demand for AMOD in the midterm model is pretty superficial, but they run the model a bunch of different times to arrive at the best possible fleet, given certain imposed constraints, such as no one's willing to wait more than X amount of time, and so forth. And so the price we arrive at is through that in a way, but it's mostly the vehicle fleet size. But whether those but we're not pricing it in this particular application for any specific social outcome, which I think is where you were trying to go with that question, because yes, if we're not priced, depending on how we price these services, would subsequently impact induced travel, right? Whether I'm going to go further, or I'll forget about the activity altogether and stay home and watch Netflix, not go to the movies and things like that. Our modeling capabilities allow us to look at those kinds of questions, but we didn't do it explicitly in this particular application. But if you're interested, I can point you to some other work that was done, especially by Moshe's team, Moshe Ben Akiva, including here in the Boston area, where they look at that particular question with a fair amount of sophistication.
And is working at MIT?
Yes, Moshe is a professor of civil engineering here at MIT. He runs the ITS lab.
Okay.
And yeah, as I referred to earlier, he's his team was the main muscle behind both the midterm and the short-term models that
Okay.
we're working with here. Or yeah.
Great. Thanks. Wonderful. Bill Barker has a great question. Bill says, my research has found that employers pay less if they are located on a bus route, but apartments charge more for being on a bus route. I think Bill is referring to employers paying for your transportation to work. I think that's what Bill's saying. Will AVs impact this dynamic where employers pay less on a bus route, but apartments charge more for being on a bus route?
Can I ask for clarification? When you say employers pay the workers less, or employers pay less for rent?
Great question. Bill, can you clarify in the chat, in the Q&A? And we'll come back to that. I'm not sure what I need that clarification too. Great. Yes, Bill's saying employers pay workers less.
Um, In
his research, he's found that.
On a bus route or at a bus stop, I guess, is another question, but we can't, I mean, it's an interesting question. I'd be very interested in seeing that research. Will AVs impact it? Well, I think in my view, it really depends on will just an AV impact that? No, because if it's just an AV, basically it's a substitute for a privately owned vehicle. And, I guess the benefit there is if it's and this is what Robin Chase would call the hell scenario. I'm borrowing from a nice YouTube video that she produced a couple of years ago. For those that are interested, Google it or YouTube search it. Where she paints the heaven or hell scenario with respect to automated vehicles. And, that part of the hell scenario is everyone's got their own AV. It drives them to work, drops them off in front, drives home, comes back and gets them at the end of the day. Right. So you basically doubled the VKT involved with every journey to work. Now, what would that mean for, if that were the case, well, you would imagine that people's demand for living near transit would probably go down. And so the demand for TOD and the price appreciation or associated with being proximate to transit stops would go down. And then on the commercial side, what would it do? You just don't tell your boss that you have an AV dropping you off in front. I don't know. A good question. I'm sorry to treat it trivially. Now, if it's an A mod service, I think it's different, right? But again, what does it mean? An employer in theory is always going to pay you less if they can, and if they feel like it's attractive for me to be in a convenient place, well, that's a benefit for you, and thus I'll pay you less.
Yeah.
But you're delving into areas that are outside of my area of expertise. So
we're asking all sorts of difficult questions, Chris. Okay, let's talk a little bit about autonomous micromobility. Paul Breslow's Paul says, I believe that autonomous micromobility will become the dominant transportation mode for short distance travel. What's your perspective on this? Additionally, when you consider AMOD, do you consider models smaller form factors that could have different travel times due to ability to lane split or use alternate paths, i.e. bike paths potentially?
No, those are awesome questions. And I hope, we don't, one of the big challenges of any kind of modeling of this nature is you're kind of like, from the gate, you're sort of stuck in history, right? And because you're estimating your models and you're calibrating your models based on existing data and observed preferences, and then maybe some stated preferences. But we basically just pretend, it's basically like a 4-seater or a 6-seater that's out there doing AMOD. I think, or I'll say, I hope that the great mobility innovation that we see, I consider it the three. There's 3 key elements. It's electric, it's autonomous or automated, it's shared. And I guess there's an addendum to that, which is, and it should be small, right? All of these combined should allow us to greatly shrink the footprint for most of our mobility. especially if we can make it pretty safe, right?
Yeah.
And so I think that possibility, if that happens, it opens up a great possibility for us to drastically change the way we use the massive right-of-ways that cut across almost all of the metropolitan areas in the United States, at least. And if that means divvying it up for, the various forms of micromobility in metropolitan areas, I think it's great. The degree to which they need to be automated is an open question, right? I mean, yeah, I think that allows you to do a lot of the balancing of supply and demand, right? That kind of was the death knell to many of the first wave dockless bike sharing.
Yeah.
I don't know if that's a helpful answer, but I think it's a great question.
Great. We love great questions. Sanjeev Nanda is hoping you can go back to the ABA bar charts slide and the meaning
Yes.
of the bars variation and the dotted red line. Can you explain that a little bit more one more time?
Yes, I do apologize. I raced through this too
That's
quickly.
okay.
So
We gave you like years of work to do in 35 minutes.
So yeah, just to give you, so these are, basically as I said, the black line is the median and the red dashed line is the mean. So outliers are excluded, but this kind of gives you the distribution. And of course, the difference between the mean and the median shows that there's a pretty skewed distribution in some cases. So just to let's walk through this one right here, okay? If you'd like. So this is, as I said, the overall impacts on accessibility. So if you look at PA, that's partial automation. So and once more, these are all relative to the baseline. So there's a 5.2. One more thing I did not talk about in the because it's somewhat complicated, but because of the nature of the accessibility we calculate here, the so-called log sum accessibility, you need to normalize it to some forms of units, and typically it can be dollars or minutes. We just chose minutes. Now, please don't interpret that to mean anything like a cumulative opportunities type measure of accessibility. It's only to make the units comparable across individuals. There's not explicit meaning of minutes in this case per se. I mean, you could also convert it to dollars, and then, if you're able to and you're convinced by it, it can be a measure of welfare, but it's just to give a sense of overall changes. I hope that's clear. I know it's a little counterintuitive or obtuse, but in this case, you can see like there's a 5.2 minute mean and a 3.16 minute median gain in accessibility in partial automation. And you can also see, if you look at that, because the black line is the median, that there's a certain share that falls above that and a certain share that falls below that, which is indicative of the distribution of that gain.
Yes.
And then if we look at the full automation one, basically that means, there's a reduction in overall accessibility, but the reduction, on the median reduction is not very large, but the mean reduction is. I'm sorry. The mean reduction is larger. Again, this is because there's there's some fraction of the distribution that gets hit really hard, and this is mostly the automobile owners.
Okay.
I hope that clarified.
I think so. We'll let them. We're gonna share the slides, by the way, everyone, tomorrow on the website. Chris is gonna PDF those, so you can pore over this in more detail.
It might have been more interesting to look at the gender one, but anyway.
Yes,
I'll leave it up here for those that want to look at it in the meantime.
Do you want to just say 1 minute about the gender one? I think it's.
Well, so yeah, I mean, again, if you interpret it similarly, so in this case, in the partial automation, men benefit more than women in terms of accessibility gains, whereas in the full automation, the women have a slightly larger gain. Again, but there's a difference in the mean versus the median, right?
Yeah.
And why is this the case? We don't know per se. I mean, you'd actually have to look at the individual activity patterns of all of the agents in the model, right? but you can hypothesize that it has something to do with the tasks of the respective heads of households, if you're male or a woman, and a
Yeah.
man or a woman, or male or female identifying.
Yeah.
In any
Could
case,
this be skewed because you looked at the head of household and that might skew more towards male?
certainly.
Yeah.
It could also, yeah, certainly. That's just one good reason. That's just one good explanation for the differences.
Yeah. Maybe one.
And I'll put
Wonderful.
this one up again for people to look at in case they're interested. But
Yeah, I
other
like
questions?
the age one. Well, we're at the top of the hour, unfortunately. There's a lot of questions we didn't get to. I'm so sorry, everyone. This was a lot of thick content from Chris, a lot of work, a lot of, how long was this study, Chris? A year, two?
This particular study, well, again, the models are constantly under development. They'll never be done. This particular study we started, I think, in, I would say, 2019. And we published this recently, but we finished this actual analysis probably 2 years later,
Great.
probably 2 years from start to finish. But the models were already there. We just kind of were continuing to improve them.
Okay. Good. Well, we have recorded this. It will be on the website. It will be emailed to you when we're, as well as the PDF of the slides on the website tomorrow. A short survey is going to pop up for everyone once you close your browser. We really appreciate your feedback. And thank you, Chris, for sharing your work with us today and under duress, time crunch. But that concludes our session. Chris, thank you again.
Thank you so much for the invitation. Thank you all for your attention, questions. Hopefully you have my contact information, and I hope you got something out of this today. It was a real honor to have the opportunity to present.
Thanks, Chris. We'll see you soon, and we'll be in touch, everybody, over email and on our website, meetingoftheminds.org. You can find more about from the slides and the presentation. Talk to you guys soon. Bye, everybody. Have a great rest of your day. Thanks, Chris.